Hello and welcome to A Slice of Medieval, where historical fact meets historical fiction. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly, best-selling author of historical non-fiction books about medieval women.
And I'm Birks, best-selling author of historical fiction. Well, in this podcast, we're talking about Richard I. So, who better to ask about Richard than best-selling novelist Ben Kane, whose recent trilogy, Lionheart, brings this controversial king to vivid life. So, hello, Ben. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Morning. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Hello, Ben. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sharon.
I have a question I've been dying to ask you since I started reading Lionheart, and that is, after such a successful career writing all things Roman, why Richard I?
I suppose, being completely frank, he's one of the most iconic figures in English/British history, and it's always wise to think of a topic that is potentially commercially successful. So probably like yourself and Derek, I'm obsessed with all periods of history. I could happily write novels set whenever, and I would like to do so at some stage in the future, but my novel writing, pays my bills. It feeds my kids. So I do always have to keep a really sort of close eye on what might do well or not do well. And they say about bands that you're only as good as your last album. And it's not quite true about novelists, I don't think, but it has a lot of relevance. And I was pitching ideas for non-Roman topics to my publisher because that was one of the things they were insisting. My new publisher, Orion, was wanting me to do a non-Roman novel, and Richard was one of the first characters that I thought of, bearing in mind that I'd looked around at lots of other periods of history. Oh, who's done such a series, who's done another series, and I wanted to try something that hadn't really been done. Obviously, Sharon K. Penman, the American novelist who sadly died in the last year or two, she'd done a big series of books about Richard, but her style of novel is quite different to mine. So I didn't feel that I would be, potentially losing out on any readers or whatever. Once I'd researched the topic, I just thought, this is the most incredible man, and the things he did were insane, especially when he went to the Holy Land. So it just took on a life of its own, as these characters do.
Yeah, he certainly gives you plenty of material, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So how did you go about researching the period? Because you've gone from Roman to 12th century. Was that a big change? Or is it just you're in research mode, so you just read as much as you can?
No, it was a huge change. It was quite a scary topic because I think it was 13 Roman novels I'd written before I started the first Richard one. And so, a bit like any historical novelist who's written a lot of books in one period, your background knowledge just becomes this great big reservoir that you can dip into without having to do massive amounts of research. And so the idea of switching forward a good 1,000 years or more, when I've got more than 10 years of experience of writing about Rome, was frankly terrifying. I spent 3 months doing nothing but research and thinking, how can I pull this off? I don't know enough. And in the end, I just literally threw myself into it. So weirdly, there isn't a textbook on Richard I that's new. There's one from about 3 years ago, and then they're pretty much the only ones that exist in English anyway are 30 and 40 years old. So I read all of them, and along with contemporary texts by monks of the time, and bought as many books about everyday life of the time as well, and literally, devoured them, but got writing after about 3 months because research can become this sort of vicious circle, and you've got to get cracking with a book. So I was researching the whole time I was writing, and the last 6 or 8 books, I've always found a friendly academic who will proofread my book for errors. And I was lucky enough to get a professor of medieval history whose specialist topic is the Angevins, and he's actually from the same university I went to in Ireland, University College Dublin. Michael Staunton is his name, and he was good enough to read the 3 books before they went to print, and luckily didn't find very much in the way of errors. There were some, but none of them required major rewrites, which was a huge relief.
So it was obviously a big change, as you've said, an entirely new historical landscape, really, isn't it, from the Roman period? So what was most difficult about that big change in what you were writing about?
What a good question. I think there isn't anything specific about the period compared to the Roman period. It was just the complete otherness of it, 1st century BC Rome compared to 12th century AD London / France / Holy Land. Everything had changed really compared to Roman times, because I mostly write about the Roman Republic, so it wasn't even a monarchy. And so it was overwhelmingly different, which was probably, I suppose, in some ways good, because I had to throw out everything I knew about Rome, rather than if it was maybe a closer time period, maybe I would have thought, oh, well, I could use this bit of information or that bit of information because that's what they were doing only 100 years ago. But it was so totally different that I pretty much disregarded anything Roman that was in my head. I mean, I threw in a few little homage. When they were in the Holy Land, I mentioned King Herod's palace and city of Caesarea, because I'd been there when I went to Israel on the research trip for Lionheart, and it was an amazing place. So I had them visit it in a couple of lines, but pretty much everything was different, and so I just had to accept that and tread lightly and make sure I wasn't making horrible mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly resonates with me as well, changing periods.
Derek went back in time to the Romans and you went forward in time from the Romans.
Yeah, it's quite funny, isn't it?
Yeah, in my case, I was going back to sort of the end of Rome rather than the Republic that you might be writing about. So there were some things that had at least evolved into the medieval period from that time of the 5th, 6th century, whereas 1st century BC or AD, I mean, that's a light year away from the medieval period. Now, I noticed, it's fairly obvious that the central character in Lionheart, apart from Richard himself, is an Irishman, Ferdia, or Rufus as he's called by the Normans. Is there I know he's Irish and you're Irish, and I'm not going to draw any sort of simplistic conclusion here, but do you identify at all with Ferdia?
Yes, that's perceptive of you. I've had this email from a couple of my really dedicated readers who noticed this. Not the kind of heroic things he does, obviously, because I'm just a normal bloke, a normal person like both of you. But there are definitely some parallels, yeah. And there are points at which, especially in the 3rd book, he's basically lived in another country for more than half his life, and his sense of being Irish is not what it was, and he wonders what it would be like to go back, and would he fit in, and would everything have changed, and so on and so on. And indeed, the feelings of ambivalence / dislike towards the English in the 1st book. When I came over to Britain more than 20 years ago, I was quite Republican and quite a strong believer in a united Ireland, not in violence, but definitely that Ireland should be one country. But most British people, unless they've been in the forces, ironically, have no idea at all of what happened in Ireland and why the Troubles happened and so on in Northern Ireland. Not trying to point fingers at all, but there was a great deal of wrong done to Ireland, which is what caused the War of Independence that saw Ireland become, win its freedom, and then did give rise to the Troubles in Northern Ireland as well. And yet, by the end of the trilogy, Ferdia / Rufus is, the most loyal servant of Richard the Lionheart you could think of. And I'm a fair-minded person. I've been living in England for however long, and I'm married to an English woman. My kids are half English / British, whatever. British people are lovely, that they're just as nice as any people anywhere else in the world. And there was a census in Northern Ireland recently in which it was revealed that Catholics were in the majority for the first time. And for most, it was really interesting because for most of my life I would have gone, hey, that's amazing. Maybe they'll vote to be to join Ireland and become one country. And I looked at it and I went, if they want to, great. And if they don't want to, if the majority vote to stay with Britain, great. It really doesn't affect me, and I don't really care. And I was actually really pleased by that response, because I think it shows that I'm a bigger person than I was 25 years ago, whatever. So
I guess, like Ferdia, you've been influenced by what is around you in other places since you left Ireland. So some parallels.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
All right, then on to the House of Anjou. This is my period as well. I've been doing about King John for the last 3 books, so I've got a lot of background on it, and I still don't think I know enough. The House of Anjou was a rather tempestuous environment. How did you manage to assess Richard's relationships with his parents and his siblings? Because I think there's a great story from Richard when John betrayed him at one point, and Richard just said, oh, he's just a boy, and he was something like 30 at the time.
That's right.
Still saw him as the younger brother.
Yeah. It's funny. You'd probably got a better handle on it than me, Sharon, if you've written a number of books just about that. Whereas, mine was sort of overarching. It was only first and the third book there was more of it. But I mean, as a writer, I was with Rufus the whole way. I would have done John in. If I was Richard, I would have literally got rid of him. Now, I think Richard would not have been the best decision because of the fact that he obviously didn't have an adult heir. He only had his nephew, who was a small child, Geoffrey's son in Brittany. But I think I tried to bring it as much to the fore as I could without being like Sharon K. Penman, who that's kind of the meat and bones of her novels, isn't it? The family politics, and it's great, but I didn't want to get into that much depth. But as I write more and more books, I've grown quite tired of writing endless battle scenes. So it's really good fun to I hear Derek laughing, so he's probably finding the same thing.
Yes,
Derek just kills off all his characters. Usually my favourites.
I've mellowed.
There's only so many ways you can slice and dice somebody. It literally does become really boring. In fact, just this morning I'm doing a Kickstarter like I do most years at this time of the this season, and I'm just writing a confrontation scene, and I thought with great delight how it won't be a fight. The fight will be avoided. It'll nearly be a fight, but it won't be a fight. So sorry, I'm moving away from the politics of the House of Anjou. There were some great quotes like the Devil's Brood, and just the whole evidence of the rebellions of the brothers against the father, in the 1170s, probably fomented by the mum, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then she obviously spent most of her life in prison because of it. But what I found, the most extraordinary thing I found about it was the way that Henry II didn't alienate his sons. Like, they'd rebel against him and then he'd kiss and make up with them. And I really struggled with getting my head around that. Maybe it's just because I'm such a black and white person. Like, if I was the king and you were my son and you rebelled against me, mate, you're not coming back into the fold. But that's easy to say, isn't it? Because if you don't kiss and make up with your eldest son, then you've got no heir. If you boot out two of the youngest ones, because John was too young, wasn't it? It was Richard and Geoffrey. Then what happens if the eldest one dies? You're back to you've got no heir except John, who's only a kid. So I don't know if what was your take on it? I did struggle with it. If friends did something dreadful to me, I'd just kind of go, well, I'm not your friend anymore. Good luck. But it's slightly different when you're a monarch.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like Henry thought boys will be boys, but Eleanor encouraging them was a really bad thing. The wife can't do it, but the boys are just spreading their wings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was this definitely inconsistency there, wasn't it? House arrest for her for 18 years or whatever, but the lads are fine.
But I also think he was letting them stay busy, because if you look at the actual sharing out of power, he gave them titles and castles, but he never actually let go of the reins to let them be their own people.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, which is why the young King Henry was so browned off, isn't it? Supposedly, yeah, because he wasn't allowed to do anything. Whereas Richard, who was given Aquitaine because of his mother, was off basically ruling from and fighting and doing siege warfare from the age of 16.
And it's definitely one of those things, you just look at it from the outside, it's like, what?
Yeah, it's really, really strange.
But I do think a lot of it was Henry just trying to hold on to everything and keeping the boys busy by letting them have a little bit of a rebellion every now and then. So long as they didn't get hold of any power, he was happy.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. It's hard to know, isn't it? But that does make sense, yeah.
Now, much is made of the need for a king to have a son. Richard didn't have a son, except for an illegitimate one. And yet he didn't seem to be that bothered. How do you describe his marriage with Berengaria? Do you think they were incompatible, or he was just more interested in fighting?
I think the latter, and maybe the both, in fact. Again, there's startlingly little information, very frustrating, because details like that are the kind of things that are really important when you're trying to flesh out an historical novel, and the sources in an awful lot of time periods are frequently silent in that regard. So it was quite sort of romantic in a way, the way he took her to the Holy Land. But when he obviously was separated from her when he was returning, she'd gone a safer route and was in Rome, and then he got taken prisoner. But when he got freed in 1194, he made very little effort to go and see her immediately, and for the subsequent 5 years of his reign appears not to have visited her very much at all. And that screams incompatibility. But then arranged marriages weren't necessarily going to be something that worked that well. But the incentive to have an heir is imperative. Everybody knows that. Even with the British royal family today, it's really quick to when people get married, they have to have a kid to make sure that the line continues. And Richard doesn't seem to have been that interested in that. My personal take, which obviously could be wrong, but just because of his attitude and the way he fought and the way he seemed to love military campaigning, was that he was one of those guys who just absolutely loved fighting, like you said, absolutely loved warfare, and he was really, really good at it. And he had John in the background, and you mentioned how he just laughed and said, "Oh, he's only a boy." I mean, maybe in the back of his mind, he thought that if Berengaria never gets pregnant, then there's always John. And also, he was relatively young when he died. He was only 42, so he could easily have been thinking in his head that there was plenty of time for him to have an heir. He might have lived until he was in his 60s or maybe even 70s, so potentially there was plenty of time to make sure that there was someone to replace him. But obviously it didn't happen, because he foolishly insisted on walking around a castle without any armor, and someone shot him in the neck with a crossbow. So yeah, a really stupid way to go, considering he was such a great war leader.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's one of those, oh damn, I should have remembered to put my armor on.
Yeah.
And as is sometimes the case, those sort of wounds in the Middle Ages, can be pretty unpleasant to die from as well. It wasn't exactly quick.
No,
was
it was almost a week it took for him to die. So
yeah.
For the listeners who don't know, the crossbow bolt of the time, I've got a replica one, and until you actually hold something like that in your hands, you don't quite realize how awful it is. So it's as long as a man's forearm and a good part of his hand. The head is barbed, and the wood of the shaft is as thick as your little finger, and it went in to him at the angle of his neck and his shoulder. So if you just behind your collarbone, or between your collarbone and your shoulder blade, if you like. So a really, really highly vascular and place where you don't want infection to get. And it lodged, and he tried to pull it out himself, wouldn't wait for the surgeon. It broke. The surgeon freed it with a great deal of effort. There was a huge amount of blood loss, and then it took him the guts of a week to die of blood poisoning. Really horrible.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you've said, I mean, this is a man who lives to fight almost. And the thing with which Richard has always been associated is obviously the Crusades. I suspect that area was quite difficult to research.
The Crusades, yes yes and no. There were, I would actually say potentially no, because unusually for the time, there are a number of accounts of his crusade, and the monks that wrote down the history of his life, along with other kings and monarchs of England, can sweep over a year of his life with a paragraph. But there are actually 5 accounts of Richard's crusade, 3 Christian and 2 Muslim, that survive in their entirety as book, and I've read them all. And I don't know if either of you have ever had this with your research, but it was the first time I'd ever had it, because clearly 800 years ago, the Christian monk who was writing down what Richard did and the Muslim cleric or scribe, in fact they were scribes, one of them was he was the secretary to Saladin, those 2 men who were writing things down, they never met each other. And so when they both wrote down the same thing to do with this campaign in the Holy Land, is pretty much a cast iron guarantee that it happened, because they didn't meet, and those texts were literally buried in the mists of time, probably for hundreds of years, until modern scholars could look at them and go, oh my goodness. And so the most dramatic scene of all, which was confirmed by these 2 opposing sides, if you like, that wrote things down, was Richard's ridiculous attack on Saladin's army outside Joppa, which is modern day Jaffa in Israel, where they'd sailed down to help take the city back, because Saladin had retaken it from the Christian defenders, and he arrived with just a few ships and literally only a few hundred men, and charged ashore, not even fully armored, charged the whole Muslim army with a few hundred men and put them to flight. And then in a battle the next day outside the walls with 12 horses or 13 horses that they'd got in the city that were complete nags, he led 2 charges on Saladin's army with 12 men, and he put them to flight. And this Muslim scribe wrote it down as well. And it's like something you go, they put that in the film because Hollywood thought it was amazing. And you're going, no, it's actually true. Yeah, so the sources were great. And I found a really great book about medieval medicine in the Crusades. And I contacted the author of that, who's a doctor in the School of Tropical Medicine in London. And he was great. He sent me a load of articles that were behind paywalls, articles of his about medicine and surgery and so on, literally in the Holy Land. And so again, like so much research, a lot of it might not have got into the book, but it was really brilliant to have that information. So
yeah, I mean that sounds fabulous. And as you say, I mean, not only did they not meet, but one of the problems sometimes with medieval sources is that they all say the same, because they've all used one of the others as the basis for their account. But in this case, that's not going to have happened. So it sort of makes it very, very valuable. And you were talking about medicine. I mean, when I was doing one of my books, I came across this Muslim scholar, totally forgotten his name. He lived in Cordoba, I think. And as you know, in the Muslim world, they were streets ahead of the rest of Europe on a lot of sort of scientific areas, and medicine was one of them.
That's right, maths, and astronomy.
Yeah. And it's interesting how much knowledge they actually had. I mean, I used to think that in the Middle Ages they didn't know anything about medicine at all. But over the years, sort of writing about it, I've realized that, whether it's a battlefield surgeon or whether it's somebody else, they actually had quite a lot of techniques for dealing with the most common problems they had.
Yeah, well, it's sort of classic human assumption, isn't it? That wherever I live, we know best. Oh, actually, the Chinese were doing that 1,000 years before, or, like you say, Muslim medicine was potentially a lot better. That's interesting, because when we were talking about the total different otherness of medieval world versus Roman world, a lot of things in 1st and 2nd century AD Rome were better than they were in medieval Europe. And medicine really hadn't advanced very much at all in 1,000 years. And it did, as you both probably know, it didn't really improve that much, until the 19th century. So it is fascinating how the knowledge can develop in one part of the world and other parts of the world just be completely ignorant of it.
It's interesting. This guy who's, I wish I could remember his name, but he wrote books about surgery and all these things, and his books were used literally for centuries in universities like Bologna and so on, where the learning was after the Renaissance, and until, as you say, about the 19th century when other things started to come in.
Was he Al-Zarahi?
Yeah, that's it. Al-Zarahi.
Yeah,
Yeah, I actually went, when I went to Cordoba, I visited the street where he lived, and it's named after him.
Yeah, fantastic. One of those things, I hadn't heard of him, and I'll quickly tell your listeners that I didn't write any characters on the Muslim side, so I didn't miss out there.
No.
Because I'm looking at that going, oh my goodness, I wish I'd known that while I was writing the books.
Well, the other, I guess, defining element of his reign, of Richard's reign, is his imprisonment, long imprisonment. It's a sort of almost unique event amongst English kings, isn't it? Was it hard to disentangle sort of fact from fiction on that, or are there sources for that are quite reliable?
No, the sources are quite reliable. I mean, one of the things I did distance myself from, I was glad when I saw that question on your list, was a lot of your listeners have probably heard of Blondel, who was supposedly Richard's musician, I think he was, and he apparently was trying to find Richard in all the various castles, I think it was, where he was being held in Germany, and would play his lute, I think it was, and Richard heard him and knew that Blondel was outside, and pretty much every book about King Richard has him in it, and I read that, and there's no history behind it at all. I just said, right, I'm not even going to mention the guy. Just no question that he's coming into it. But no, we know the places he was held, when he was held there, when he was moved. Various times, there was a horrible bishop, a French bishop, who at one point made sure that Richard was chained up with chains that were so heavy that a horse couldn't have moved for a week or two. And there's some other details that when he was allowed out and his conditions were loosened, if you like, and he was able to have his falcons brought from England so that he could go hunting. Obviously, he must have given a promise that he wouldn't try to escape. So there's some great details there, but I did also, gloss over, move the plot forward. I didn't linger in the prison cell with him, because that's a fairly limiting thing to do unless you're setting a book like that. But I didn't find it too difficult. Blondel is the only clear example I can think of where I just thought, no, that's nonsense. I'm not. It's like Robin Hood when Richard went to Nottingham when he was freed in 1194. He one of the reasons he had to go there was to make sure all his nobles were doing what they had to do, and he had to retake the castle. But that's when all the books that are about Robin Hood say that the king met him. I didn't even mention Robin Hood. I quite like sticking to facts where I can.
Well, yeah.
I get that. It's funny. There's a story that I discovered going on the Blondel thing. A contemporary of Richard's, Ella of Salisbury, who was married to Richard's half-brother, William Longspay. She was supposedly kidnapped when her father died to prevent her falling into the hands of ruthless people, and supposedly held in a castle in France. And a minstrel toured the castles of France, singing under windows for her to sing back to him. And it's like, that's Blondel.
Yeah.
So it might be that it was a medieval trope by the chroniclers at some point where they thought, oh, let's put a minstrel in to find her.
Yes. Yeah, that's I didn't know that. That's fascinating. And I totally agree. It's very common, as you both know, I'm sure, for the same type of story to exist at different time periods. People like having a stylized story, don't they?
Yeah, and obviously, but when that happens and you've got really good sources, it's not so much of a problem. But when it happens and your sources are really sparse, that's when it becomes really difficult to know quite what's happening and what isn't.
Yeah, that's what I tell. But if I'm doing talk on the Romans, I always mention that if you get something that's mentioned in only one source, you've got to treat it with a great deal of suspicion. It's only if it's mentioned in two or more sources that we don't think copied each other that you can go, okay, well, it's quite likely that happened then. Not all historical sources can be treated, as gospel truth.
Really?
Well, this is it, but it's something that a lot of I'm sure you both get it on your Facebook page or whatever, or emails. Well, somebody said this and you didn't put that in your book, and we know it happened because, and you're just going, no, that's not true. As Billy Connolly said, it was in the sun, so it must be true.
So Ben, what is your take on Richard as a king and a man?
I get asked this quite a lot, a bit like I don't know if either of you've had similar, or Derek, if you've had it with around the Wars of the Roses. Who was the worst emperor, the best emperor in Rome, or the best monarch, or the best whatever of England, and my answer is often goes along the lines of something like, well, I actually am opposed to the idea of monarchy in the first place. So I come from a republic, Ireland, and I believe in a head of state, but I don't believe in a hereditary head of state. So I'm not a good person to ask about who's a good king and who's a bad king. But I also think it's one of those questions that's almost impossible to answer, because how do you define it? So there are an awful lot of untruths, commonly held misconceptions about Richard, that he was a bad king because he bled England white to fund his crusade and to get himself out of prison. That he was a bad king because he only spent 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, and so on and so on and so on. I'll just set those two aside first. The pipe rolls, which are official documents that still survive from the period of Richard and John, show us the amount of income that came into the royal treasury and was spent. John spent more money than Richard did for his ransom on his war with France in the years after Richard's death. So John actually spent more money than Richard. So that disproves that he bled England white. At least it proves that his brother did the same. And in fact, the revenues from Normandy and other parts of France were greater than that of England. Second thing, what about the period he spent in England was that most of his territory was actually in France. And if his brother hadn't basically given away half of France, and Philippe Capet, the French king, hadn't taken a lot of it as well during his period of incarceration, he wouldn't have had to have spent all his time there getting back all the territory anyway. And his father, Henry II, spent large amounts of his reign in France as well, because, as I said, most of the English king's dominion was 2/3 of modern day France. So was he a good king? What was he like as a man? He was certainly an effective ruler. So he wasn't just a battle leader. He was very astute. The institutions, the people he put into place before he left for the crusade were good choices, because England ran really smoothly, and his mum did a lot, but it was often the officials he put in place who did a good job. And even when he was incarcerated, on his return, trying to return from the crusade, England did not fall apart. So he wasn't just a war leader. We know that he was fluent in several languages. He used to write poetry, and he was a musician as well. So he wasn't just this beefy soldier who liked fighting all the time. I think he must have been incredibly charismatic because of the way that his soldiers followed him. That battle I described outside Jaffa. There are nice examples after his freeing from prison, when he was fighting all around northern France, taking back castles from Philippe Capet. There are lovely examples of how he would, in one siege that was lifted, he went in and he literally lined up all the soldiers, and he went along kissing them all in congratulation and giving them rewards. And when a leader does something like that, men will literally die to follow him. And so I think he was a complex man, and I think he actually did a pretty good job of what he needed to do to hold on to his territories when he was away. And going off, you could argue that going off to take back Jerusalem and so on, that was crazy. But in those times, it was regarded as the best thing you could do would be to go to the Holy Land and take it back from the Muslims. And he probably went the lengths he went to because he liked fighting, and none of the other monarchs kind of were that into it. They were more interested in holding on to their stuff at home. So you could argue that he lost focus there. But yeah, I think he was quite unique in how much he liked warfare, because that was not something most kings did back then. Big battles like in Roman times didn't happen in the 12th century. What was he like as a man? He certainly, I wouldn't have wanted to have been married him. I wouldn't wanted to have been Berengaria. He wasn't a stay-at-home with pipe and slippers type of chap, that's for sure. I suspect he would have been somebody that you could fall out with quite easily. I think he probably had a temper, as they'd say in Ireland, quite a temper.
Andrew Van Temper is quite famous, isn't it? Henry II used to roll around the floor thumping the floor and foaming at the mouth when he got mad.
Quite childish, eh? I think a very charismatic and likable person, but you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him.
Yeah, I think I can agree with you with that. I don't think he was a bad king. It's just he was a man of his time as well. And I think people don't allow for what was going on in Europe at the time. Yes, he went on crusade, but to be fair, so did the Holy Roman Emperor, and so did Philip II.
Yeah.
His enemies went with him. It's just they came home early.
That's right.
So why do you think he divides historical opinion?
Bad history. I honestly, those 2 points I mentioned about him being a bad king and bleeding England dry, whatever, and you get the whole thing. Oh well, he was gay, and so on and so on. And if you dissect down the history behind those, it's pretty much all incorrect, and I think that's a lot of it. And I think historians of the 19th century, maybe early 20th century, they were very uncritical in the way they looked at texts from way back in history, and painted these pictures that then fed through for much of the 20th century. I don't know whether you both agree with this, but more studied histories and biographies of historical characters, say the last 20 years, have been much more, okay, is there really proof that this king or this queen did that? Oh, well, if you look back at the texts, you'll find that that's actually more ambivalent than the Victorians thought. I think that was a lot of the reason people wanted to sort of put a name on a king, and it was very easy to go, oh well, he wasn't there, he was only in England for 6 months out of 10 years. Oh well, that must mean he's a bad king. Well, if you look at the reasons I described, they make perfect sense for him not to be there. England was peaceful enough for him not to be there. A lot of France was not. Ergo, he needed to be in France. It wasn't like he was going, oh, I don't like the air in London, I'm going to go and sit by the sea in Normandy.
Yeah, I think what you said about the late 19th century and early 20th century historians certainly resonates with me, because Trevelyan and Macaulay and so on, they kind of invented a mold of British history and European history, which everybody followed for decades and decades. And we were all taught it in school, and even maybe now. That's the more worrying thing, is that I think it's very difficult for people to accept that what they've been steeped in throughout their childhood might be wrong.
Yeah. People don't like change, whether it's to do with history or societal values or whatever. But people resist change in whatever form it takes. Most British people don't know about Irish history. If you ask me about that, I could go off and talk literally all day about Irish history, and English people just, oh my goodness, oh, I had no idea, and so on, because it's not taught. And there is sometimes a real pushback. Oh well, that couldn't be true. That's not true. So I think that's human nature, really.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad history about, is what we're saying.
Yeah, a lot of bad history, and even the stuff that you think is good, you can't be sure it's true. So Manda Scott, who's a friend, a brilliant historical fiction author, she told me about this book a few years ago, and it was about a British Army unit in Afghanistan that was involved in some hideous battle, really brutal battle for a number of days, I think it was. And this journalist decided he wanted to write a book about it, and so he got permission from the Ministry of Defence to interview the soldiers who'd taken part, and not only was he able to interview literally everyone from the soldiers who'd been taking place to the commanding officer who'd been wherever he was in the base in Afghanistan or maybe in Britain, overseeing everything, and he even had the footage from the soldiers' body cams. And the mad thing was that everybody's account of pretty much everything differed, and he was recording history that has taken place 2 years before or something. And Manda was saying, so you go back and you get something about Richard the Lionheart, which is from 800 years ago, and you can go, how on earth do we know that any of this is actually correct?
Well, it's true. I mean, the police, the police do state that when they interview people after an incident, you interview 5 people, you get 5 different stories. Nobody, even the colour of a shirt somebody's wearing will change based on the perception of each witness.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I almost think that that the historical fiction, in some ways, you could argue, because of what we just said, it's almost fantasy potentially, because it could all be wrong.
Yeah, they should have a government health warning in front of all of them. Well, they do, don't they? These are at the beginning. Yeah, it's all fiction. Don't believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah, even ones like Ben's who are based on a historical character, the Lionheart.
Yes, yeah. Apart from Richard the First, obviously. Okay. Well, that's been really fascinating, and thank you for going into so much depth about the issues surrounding what you were writing about, because that's been really good, and your insight into it has been really helpful. And I think anybody listening has got a pretty good idea about Richard from what you've been saying. So that's really good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. It's been fabulous. Oh, and thanks for writing the books, because each one has managed to
it's been
let
a
me
pleasure.
work out what my dad was getting for Christmas. He's getting King this year.
Oh, thank you. I hopefully enjoyed them.
He did.
And it's been a pleasure, and I love chatting to other authors of historical fiction, because obviously just differences spring up, but I think what I noticed a lot this morning was that how many similarities, or you shared my opinions to do with research, or perceptions and opinions and so on. People change and times change, but some things are the same throughout history, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got another project on the go, haven't you? Napoleon's Spy.
Yes, thanks for mentioning it. I moved on.
Another great leap forward.
Another great leap forward, yeah. And I'm doing Vikings next. So the fear factor that I felt writing the first Lionheart book is now completely gone. And so I threw myself into 19th century, the invasion of Russia. That's what the novel is about, and that's coming out next year. I'm just waiting on the edit today, actually. That was absolutely brilliant fun to write. I say brilliant fun. It's so grim. It wasn't fun at times, but what was absolutely brilliant was that there are more than 150 first-hand accounts. So that's what's coming out next year, and I'll be very excited to hear what some of your listeners might think of it.
I'm looking forward to that.
It's May, I think it comes out, isn't it?
That's right.
Maybe we can get you back on the podcast to talk about Napoleon's Spy and a completely different period of history.
Oh, that'd be lovely. Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
Yes, please. I've been into the Napoleonics ever since the first Bernard Cornwell books came out when I was a teenager.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I read so many of them when I was a teenager as well. I really loved them. Didn't ever think I'd be writing that period, but there you go.
Anyway, in the meantime, Ben, thanks ever so much for joining us, and maybe I'll see you next year sometime.
Brilliant. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Sharon. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Ben. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much to Ben Kane. That was absolutely fascinating. If you want to find his books, Lionheart, Crusader, and King by Ben Kane, you won't regret it. They're absolutely fabulous read. Thank you very much to everyone for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks.
So we'll be back next time with something special for Christmas.